Hello, thank you for joining me in this fourth video dealing with the topic of the writings of Enoch. Now this video is going to be on the topic of hell, and I'd like to begin by asking you a few questions. Have you ever wondered what Scripture means when it talks about heavens or heavenly realms, as in the plural? Most people think of heaven as being this one place and hell being another, and that's it. But Scripture many times mentions heaven or heavenly realms in the plural sense. Another question I have has to do with something that Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It tells a story, and depending on what translation you are reading, the story is either that he was taken up to the third level of heaven, or that he knew of somebody who was taken to the third heaven. Now, whether it was him or somebody he knows isn't relevant. My question is, what is the third heaven? Have you ever thought of it? For this lines up with what Scripture does talk about in the plural sense, that there are different levels to heaven. And then finally, my third question is, and it has to do with Luke 16, where Jesus tells the story of Lazarus and the rich man. I'm sure most of you know it, and if you don't, I just ask that you read it. Now, my question is this: is it a parable, or is Jesus telling a real story? Now, if you read the New Living Translation, it actually has a heading for it, and it calls it the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. So the New Living Translation specifically says that it is a parable. But what do you think? The translation you read may not say parable. So what do you think? Is it a parable, or is Jesus relating a true story of what part of heaven is actually like? I've heard it argued that because he uses an actual name, that is not a parable. On the other hand, I've had people who say that it is a parable. They look for all kinds of symbols in it. I've heard them say, well, the colors that he uses to describe the rich man, what he wears, is relating to the Catholic Church. So I've heard all kinds of different things, but no real evidence or proof. So my question is, what do you think the story means, and why does Jesus tell the story? Okay, after having thought of those three questions, I want to give you the answer. The third heaven that Paul was referring to is the same place that Jesus was talking about. The place that Jesus described, that some people call a parable, well, it's not a parable. It's an actual place, and it is the third level of heaven. The third heaven. And we find it described in the writings of Enoch. Enoch describes how he was taken actually to a total of 10 different levels in heaven. And the third level is where paradise is. But not only paradise, but also the place where those people who do evil, who continue to live in sin, is a place where they are punished. He describes both being on the same level, just as Jesus described it in his story. The only difference is, in the writings of Enoch, he doesn't describe this great chasm in between. That's the only difference, but he talks about going from one to the other on the same level of heaven. So if we read Enoch, he clarifies so much of Scripture, like I've already explained in the other videos, but here he clarifies heaven. And this story that Jesus tells, so many people believe that it's a parable, and yet if they were only to read Enoch, they would see that it's an actual place that Jesus is talking about. And it puts a whole new light on that particular teaching. And the same thing with Paul. It shows that, or it explains to us exactly where Paul went to, or the person that he knows went to, when he talks about going to the third heaven. And so when we see these terms of heaven or heavenly realms, we know that it's a fact, it's actual, and it's taken from the writings of Enoch. Because that's the only other place where we see a description of the different levels of hell. Now, I want to talk about one more thing about the teachings of Enoch and hell. And that has to do with eternity. And it will change, many of you, your opinion and your thoughts on hell. I've heard a lot of people say that they can't accept a God who would punish people for an eternity. They can't imagine that their family or friends would be in hell for eons, for trillions and trillions of years. And in fact, some people say they can't imagine being in heaven, that even a perfect place for trillions and trillions of years. And people think about eternity in time. But I'm going to include in the sidebar, in the information part, an excerpt from the writings of Enoch. And it explains how at the end of at the beginning of the 8th day, that time ceases to exist. That no longer are years, months, and days counted. And this is the eternity that God talks about when he's saying hell and heaven. He's talking about an eternity that is something so vastly different from what we are able to imagine that it's ridiculous to even try to imagine. But what we do know is that eternity is not counted in the way that we count it. It's not counted in the time as we know it. And so this puts a whole new spin on what we think of hell. It also speaks to prophecy, which I'll be talking about in my next video. But what I really encourage you to do is to read the information part that I include. And it explains that explains that God relates one day into 1,000 years. And that from the time of Adam to the end of 7,000 years is 7 days. 1,000 years being 1 day. And at the end of the 7,000 years, at the beginning of the 8th day, the first day following his work, time will cease to exist. Okay, that's all I have for this video. As I said, in my next one, I'm going to be talking about prophecy. Till then, peace and blessings.